Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome along to Engineers Ireland. My name is Roy O'Connor. I chair the Roads and Transportation Society. So look, we're delighted to have you along here today. Our topic is best practice in cost estimating and risk contingency. So before I introduce our two speakers from Chandler KBS, just go through a few of the basics of housekeeping for the talk today. So the basics are, look, questions and answers function at the bottom of your Zoom window there. Please put them into that dialog box and we'll triage those after the presentation, which is going to be around 40 minutes long or so. And also there's a chat function if you have any technical issues, and Elba and Lubna will be in the background there to address any of your issues. We'll be making the presentation available after the event on the Engineers Ireland website, from when it starts recording at the introductions through to the final slide, and then the Q&A afterwards is off the recording. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our two speakers today. They're both from Chandler KBS, Eamon Scullion, who has been a partner there since 2012. He leads their provision of services throughout Ireland and is the sector lead for highways and aviation. Eamon's responsible for delivery of cost management services to a number of major clients, including the National Transport Authority, Transport Infrastructure Ireland, and the Department of Infrastructure in Northern Ireland. He's the partner lead in the development of the cost management guidelines on behalf of Chandler KBS. And notable projects Eamon has been involved in include Dublin Metro Link and Dublin Bus Connects and DART continuation. So he's joined today by Pádraig O'Hagan. So Pádraig has been an associate with Chandler KBS since 2016. And as well as providing cost management services, he also provides expert witness and claims advisory services. So working with Eamon, he's responsible for managing delivery of a number of major infrastructure projects, including the A5 Western Transport Corridor and the A8 Belfast-Tulare dual carriageway. He's responsible for drafting the cost management guidelines on behalf of Chandler KBS and has worked on a number of projects estimated using those guidelines. So including those projects that he's been working on recently, there's the Limerick Urban Revitalisation Project, which is the O'Connell Street, the main street there in Limerick, Waterford North Quays and the Clontarf to City Centre in Dublin city centre, the Clontarf to Amiens Street cycleway. Apologies there for the stumble. So without further ado, guys, I'm going to hand over to yourselves. I can see your slides there. Eamon, it's yourself first up. So if you want to say hello there, I'll let you at it.
No problem. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today here as part of your active travel series. It's great to see so many participants. It's certainly one of the biggest attended sessions that I've been involved in. So today's presentation, best practice in cost estimating and risk contingency. What we're after and what we're going to hopefully get across today is a no surprise approach to cost management. What we're presenting may seem very high level, but it's amazing how many cost estimates we see and clients see that don't really include the fundamentals of cost estimate. And that's what Pádraig is going to go into later on in the presentation. The cost management guidelines that we're going to base the presentation on is all about proportionality, whether that's the size of the job, the value of the job, and the program of the job. And hopefully the message we'll get across later today is proportionality and what we need to do for certain jobs. Next slide, Pádraig. So you've already heard about myself and Pádraig, both Chandler KBS. I've been a partner since 2012 and associate, very able associate since 2016. A lot about Chandler KBS. We're an independent cost consultancy service. We work across Ireland, UK, and Europe. Our core service is cost management, project management, procurement, and so on. And we're heavily involved in the highways, infrastructure, aviation, building, utilities, and energy sector. What we would point out is we work right across Europe, and we're trying to bring all the best practice into what we've done with the cost management guidelines. Our major clients, we work with some of the major clients in Ireland, UK. We've been working with the NTA now about 4 to 5 years. It's been very successful on our part. Hopefully NTA think the same. And we've recently been awarded the TII cost management and claims advice roles that's available to not only TII but all the county councils throughout Ireland. So we're hopeful there's some in the audience today, and we're happy to help us as we move on. Health warning before I pass over to Pádraig. We're very clear here. We're not telling you how to do your job, and I hope that message comes through. We fully appreciate that every project is different, and the situation is different, the internal governance is different, the reporting requirements are different. all this is, it's our experience and best practice and lessons learned, and what we consider to be industry best practice. So I'll hand you over to Porrig, who'll take us through a little bit of pace, the core constituents of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Eamon. So for anyone that missed the introduction, my name's Porrig O'Hagan. I'm going to take you through the remainder of the presentation today. And I think a very good place to start here is cost estimating in context and why accurate cost estimating is important. So a number of organizations will basically use future projection of scheme costs to actually identify the amount of resource and resource profiling that they require. They'll look back at historical project outturn costs to see what resource was engaged, and they'll project that into the future on that basis. But regardless of your organization, cost estimates will inform the investment strategy, and they're very, very important to ensure that in the investment strategy that we're obtaining value for money, and also that our projects are affordable. Accurate cost estimates also provide a project baseline. It's very important that we measure our performance against this baseline. And what I would say to that as well is that robust yet challenging cost estimates have the potential to act as an incentive as well. So they can actually help us to improve our project performance. Probably the most obvious aspect of cost estimating is how they feed into budgets. And that's obviously linked to the investment strategy. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on that. But I suppose what I would like to talk about here a little bit in detail isn't the most necessary or the most obvious point as to why accurate cost estimating is important. And no matter how many cost estimates that we have that are accurate and reflect the outturn cost on a project, it's often the projects that have outturn costs that exceed budgets substantially are the ones that make the news headlines. So for example, just a few snippets from different news articles, websites over the last 2.5 years. Obviously in the Republic of Ireland, the one that is in the news quite regularly at the moment is the Children's Hospital, but this cost overruns is something that's inherent across our industry, regardless of where we work. In Northern Ireland, just last year, there was a £700 million cost overrun reported on key infrastructure projects. In the UK, HS2 is one of the largest schemes currently ongoing at the moment, and it's regularly in the news as well. And we just have to look back 10 years to see that this is a historical issue, looking at the London Olympics and how much that exceeded the budget as well. So perception and confidence are a large part of why accurate cost estimating is important. A little bit about working with the National Transport Authority. So we basically began our relationship with the NTA in 2017. In 2019, we were asked to review their cost management guidelines and to try and develop an improve them. The remit that we were given was that they were to be consistent, they were to be prescriptive, they were also intended to be proportionate according to the scheme value. And probably most important is the fourth bullet point here, is that the guidelines were intended to be capable of producing a cost estimate that was reflective of the final outturn cost. And as Eamon said there at the beginning of the presentation, it was intended to foster a no surprise approach to project delivery. Why were we asked to do this? I suppose the NTA had experienced historical project cost escalation, and with the 2040 development plan in place, they wanted to get in place guidelines that eradicated these issues at source. There was limited defined process within the previous guidelines, and we also identified that there's actually limited ownership, transparency, or accountability within those guidelines as well. One point here I would like to go into a little bit of further detail in is that term final outturn cost, and what do we actually mean by that? For a lot of people, it only really relates to construction costs, but if we take away any point today, is final outturn cost should relate to the total liability to the exchequer or the funder of the project, and it's all of those costs that arise from the delivery of a project. So it isn't just the direct cost of construction, it includes a number of other cost components, including but not limited to consultancy costs, whether these be preparation or administration, land costs, and also compensation for, cost heads such as injurious affection that may arise from the project, utilities costs, which might be to do with diversions or betterment. And we also have the costs associated with uncertainty. So that will include items such as inflation, risk, and contingency. And we go into a bit of detail in each of those towards the end of today's presentation. And then obviously VAT is a very important cost, and probably out of all the cost heads, that's the one that is most commonly forgotten about and not included. And it is probably because it is so obvious that it would be a cost that should be considered. A final note on this slide is just that uncertainty over what a project might cost or what a cost might be, it's not an adequate reason to not include it within a cost estimate. We can include a cost estimate for anything. We may need to supplement it with certain assumptions, but those assumptions should be communicated to your client or and considered. And if they're not considered acceptable assumptions, they can be changed and the cost estimate changed accordingly or amended accordingly. So this is what the front cover of the cost management guidelines will look like whenever it's published. It should be published within the next month or two. But on this slide, I just really wanted to identify the relationship with other guidance. So we have the Public Spending Code, which sets out guidance and requirements in terms of evaluating, planning, and managing public investment in projects. There's a requirement on public sector and government organizations to put in place their own guidelines to manage project costs, which essentially is what the cost management guidelines are doing for the NTA. The Capital Works Management Framework is also a government developed set of guidelines. And basically what these set out is a best practice approach, and they actually contain a set of templates on how cost estimates should be produced. And in our cost management guidelines, we've attempted to incorporate as many aspects of the Capital Works Management Framework as we can. The Transport Infrastructure Ireland Cost Management Manual is also a relevant piece of or guidance document that we refer to in the development of the cost management guideline. And as one of the NTA's main local sponsoring agencies, we also consulted with Transport Infrastructure Ireland to ensure that we were as consistent as we possibly could be. And probably one of the more important and last reference parts of guidance here that I wanted to touch on was the project approval guidelines, which is also a National Transport Authority guidance document. And basically it's a sister document of the cost management guidelines. They talk to each other, they consistently reference each other, and basically the cost management guidelines supplement the project approval and project management requirements. So how we attempted to improve the NTA's cost management guidelines. These are points that can be relevant to any organization, and they can, in our opinion, improve the way that we prepare cost estimates. So what we tried to do was we developed cost estimating templates for various project phases. We developed a robust risk management process that was to be adhered to. We developed a contingency calculator, which basically provided an output as to contingency levels for specific projects. And we also put in place a robust framework for project reporting. In each of those sections then, this is what a cost estimate template looks like in the cost management guidelines. On the face of it, it might look like an onerous enough document. I assure you it is a fairly simple document to populate, and it acts as a summary. The features of these templates is that they're intended to provide a consistent format to present cost estimate. In no way are they intended to constrain estimating good practice. This is simply a summary document. All of your supplemental information and background information should sit behind this. If you like, it's intended to act as an aide-memoire or an estimating prompt, whereby the NTA want each of the sponsoring agencies or the users of this document to consider specific cost heads. As I said earlier, they're intended to create an element of transparency and auditability in project costs, and this will facilitate project tracking and the implementation of lessons learned. As I said, we've developed formal risk management processes. This is just a visual representation of a simple risk register that we've developed. I'll talk about this more towards the end of the presentation, but I just wanted to identify what the risk registers within the templates look like and the guidelines look like. Contingency quantification was something new that we added to the guidelines. We developed a contingency calculator, which was based on the concepts of reference class forecasting. So for anyone that doesn't know what reference class forecasting, it's basically looking at a subset of similar projects referred to as a reference class, identifying how those projects performed in terms of their outturn costs against different project estimates, and basically developing an adjustment factor to our cost estimates to account for that outside view on projects. They're designed to overcome optimism bias, and optimism bias is the systematic tendency to look at a project overly optimistically. So basically we get tainted by a want for a project to proceed. Again, the contingency quantification and calculator is intended to be proportionate, and that will be according to the project phase and the project complexity, which we'll touch on later. And ultimately, it provides an easy to use output, which is linked to the estimating templates. As I said, we've created a robust framework for project reporting, and this is around the point that Eamon suggested earlier, the no surprise approach to project delivery. There are pre-construction reports, final account reports, and construction phase reports, and that's basically to keep the NTA in the loop of their funding requirements and funding liabilities throughout that process. I suppose this is really moving on to the main point of today's presentation, that is, how to prepare robust estimates using cost management guidelines. And the NTA cost management guidelines are essentially Chandler KBS's view on what robust best practice is. Step one, it might seem like a fairly obvious step, but you need to actually decide on what project band your project will fall into. So there are 3 bands under the guidelines. A band 1 is not to 500,000 euro, band 2 is 500,000 euro to 10 million euro, and a band 3 is above 10 million euro. The reason this is important is because that the deliverables and the requirements of each of these the deliverables are band specific. Estimating requirements are actually proportionate depending on the band that you're in. So for example, if you refer to the matrix here in band 1, you maybe only have 7 or 8 requirements, whereas for a band 3, you might have up to 20 requirements as from a cost management perspective. This is intended to streamline the estimating process in terms of making it proportionate. And this matrix that you see on screen, you'll actually identify this within your cost management guidelines. It's a good starting point to review, and it provides an easy to use output, which is linked to the estimating templates. Once you've decided on your project band, the next point that we would suggest that you refer to is the text within the guidelines. That might seem, fairly obvious point to make, but the text, if read in its entirety, it does appear to be quite onerous. But the way that we've designed the cost management guidelines is that you can basically pick up any band within the cost management guidelines and they can be read in isolation. With that as well, you can actually pick up a phase within a band and that can be read in isolation from the other requirements of the cost management guidelines. So I would urge anyone that will be using the guidelines to take a read of them and actually familiarize yourself with them. They're not as onerous as they appear at first sight. They're actually, in our view, which may be slightly biased, but we feel they're user-friendly. If you want to accelerate your review of the cost management guidelines, a further reference point is the flowcharts. As you can see on screen here now, there are 3 different flowcharts which are relevant to each of the project bands. It's very obvious from looking at your screen here that as you move through the project bands, the requirements become more onerous. However, what I would suggest here is with a band 3 project, which has the most onerous requirements, they tend to be delivered over maybe a period of years. So whilst there may be many more deliverables, these deliverables are more spread out than what a band one project was. So it's not as daunting as it appears from first sight. Just for demonstration purposes, I just wanted to make things a little bit more legible on your screen. So you should see the band 2 flowchart. And for the purposes of today, I'm probably going to refer to the phase 5, which is detailed design and procurement phase. Each of the deliverables can be split into 2 different types. So we have our key deliverables in the cost management requirements at phase 5, and the key deliverables here is the pre-tender estimate and the total project budget. The pre-tender estimate is very obvious. It's the last estimate before you actually go to tender, and that's really informing the affordability of the project based on the current design information. The total project budget takes consideration of the project costs that have been tendered, and it is basically the most robust cost estimate that we can have before proceeding to construction phase. The next set of deliverables we have it's the supporting information. Whilst there are, I think there's 7 different items identified here, the 2 that we're going to focus on today is quantification of risk and quantification of contingency. The rest are all supplemental. Quantification of risk and contingency is relevant to the preparation of cost estimates, and we go into detail on that towards the end of this presentation. Step 3 is, again, some of these might seem fairly obvious, but we believe that they're noteworthy. You know, a good point here is actually to review the information that you have to hand before you ever actually start to plan your cost estimate. You should be considering different project specifics, such as the project type. You know, your project type will ultimately derive what type of estimate you will prepare, or dictate the type of estimate you'll prepare. You know, the complexity of the project will also have an impact on the level of estimate that you can actually produce. The location of your project is going to have a major impact, whether it's urban or rural, which will have a direct impact on things such as your traffic management and also your outputs. Availability of design and site information is very relevant, and you would expect that to become more advanced as you develop through your project. But again, it's something that you need to consider, as is stakeholder interface. The last 4 bullet points that you can see on screen here, they're more external influences or external factors that we need to consider, but they can have a direct impact on the way that you produce your cost estimate. So you need to consider, you know, what resource that you have available to you, both in terms of the number of resource and also the skill and experience level of that resource and how well they are suited to preparing a specific estimate. You also need to look at what funding you have available, you know, to allow you to prepare the most robust cost estimate as possible. There will be a direct link between the 2. And the same as with time constraints. Obviously, the longer we have to prepare a cost estimate, the more detail you would expect to be able to go to, and the more accurate you would expect the cost estimate to be. So careful planning is very important. And the last point here, it is a really relevant point. We shouldn't succumb to external or internal pressures. We should always try to objectively come to what we believe to be the right estimate for the project. So we need to consider if external and internal pressures need to be dealt with at an organizational level. Closely linked to step 3 then is actually just planning how you're going to develop your estimate. So you'll see here a list of different types of costs. Typically, this is in a similar order to what I've experienced in the past, but this order can change up depending on the type of project that you have. And in planning the estimate, there's many factors that we'll need to take into consideration. You know, what information do you have available to you? What is the standard of design information that you've been provided with? You may want to carry out a gap analysis on the information that you've been provided with and look at what other information can be obtained. You know, this might be receiving different types of standard details. It might be raising queries with your designers. It could also be referencing of specialist price books. We also need to consider what parts of the estimate are we relying on third parties. This might be for specialist activities. It could be for utility organizations. It could be from district valuers for land costs. But all of these third parties need to be considered and need to be liaised with in a timely manner, which is important that we plan this process. We also need to look at the procurement strategy. And a lot of the projects that I've worked on that are of a complex nature, early contractor involvement has been considered. If that's the case, we may need to consider some market engagement in the later cost estimates. So the detailed design cost estimates, we may actually be in the process of developing business cases or target costs. Another point here is we also may need to take a view on what the experience level of our internal resources, what the expertise is. Do we need support from a specialist cost manager, specialist engineer, or actual specialist subcontractors? Consider if support is required. And then the final step here is it's actually just to take a step back. Don't get overawed by the information that you have. Don't jump into a cost estimate without actually carefully planning. And that taking a step back might actually be discussing with a colleague what their view on the best approach is. And then step 5 is actually developing the estimate. So it took us quite a while to get here, but in order to prepare a cost estimate effectively, we need to go through those other stages. There's the first step is, or the first cost head that we're going to look at is construction, and there are 2 aspects to it. We have the measurement and we have the pricing. Depending on the design information, we might develop a cost estimate based on high-level methods of estimating, which could be a cost per kilometre or a cost per square metre. But if we're in phase 5, detailed design, we would suggest that detailed bills of quantities should be able to be produced. This model here, which I believe we've taken from the Transport Infrastructure and Cost Manual, it actually it's a very good visual representation of how estimating and the methods of estimating should change as your design matures and as you move through each of the project phases. So at the beginning of a project, you would expect a high level of elemental estimating. As you move through the project, this should be replaced by more unit cost estimating, which in the construction phase will be replaced in its entirety by the pricing schedule and the risk register. In terms of how we price construction costs, for me, a very good reference point is actually looking at unit cost information from recently delivered and comparable projects. But it is very rare that we always have those recently delivered and comparable projects to hand. So you can adjust them. We can adjust them by using indices, for example, to adjust for location and time, or you may actually be able to adjust it for project-specific considerations, taking into account factors such as economies of scale or project-specific factors such as ground conditions. This will provide a very good output at component and elemental level, which is proportionate for cost estimating. And we can use this information for benchmarking as well, which we'll refer to later in the slides. At this point, I would just like to note that there are other sources of information that we can use. There are price books out there, such as SPAWNs, which you can use also. There's some websites and external sources that you can use. So in the UK, we would tend to use BCIS quite a lot if we don't have that source of information in-house. As I said at the earlier part of the presentation, the construction costs are only one part of a cost estimate. We need to consider everything else. So if it's typically a highways type project, traffic management could be a significant factor. One of the factors we might base it on in the earlier phases is a percentage of construction costs or a cost per kilometre by looking at historical project cost information. We may also then, as the project develops, establish a traffic management plan, which can be priced on a unit method of assessment. Similar is with preparation and supervision or administration. Again, earlier phases, we may use percentages or rates per kilometres added to base costs, or alternatively, as the project develops, we would develop resource schedules with consultants and price this using tendered rates, or alternatively, market rates that we would have available to us through our cost database. Works for statutory undertakers. Again, we can use benchmark data in the earlier phases, but Chandler KBS would always recommend that we liaise as early as possible with utility companies to get a better understanding of what their diversionary requirements are, what their design requirements are, or if they're actually required to carry out the works directly, what their cost estimate of the works would be. And the same applies with land. Land's a little bit of a dark art. We can estimate the cost per acre to buy land, but there are other aspects that we need to take consideration of, as referenced earlier, injurious affection, where there are alternative methods of assessing this. So we would always advise liaising with district valuers or specialists. In Northern Ireland, we would tend to liaise with Land and Property Services at the earliest point that we can, as soon as the land requirements are established for a project. I touched on that earlier. It's a very important cost head that we need to consider, and it's important to refer to the most up-to-date legislation and guidance that is available. And then finally, assessing uncertainty. We've identified 3 different factors of uncertainty within cost estimating. There may be more, but these are the most common. So inflation, contingency, and risk. And I'm going to touch on these in a little bit of detail. What is inflation? So in cost estimates, it's making provision for the changes in costs between the estimate base date and project completion. And what we mean by the estimate base date, it's essentially the date that our cost estimate is prepared, because that should be the date that our prices are current from. So we need to make provision for the change in the value of money over time, or the value of what we can buy over time for the project delivery. There's 2 important aspects in terms of adjusting for inflation. The first of which is we need to determine when a cost will be incurred and what that cost will be at that period of time. And then we need to assess what that cost will be in future monetary terms. So the value of €1 now is not the same as with the value of €1 in a couple of years' time, and we need to consider that within our cost estimate. There's various methods that we can use. I've put a couple of examples on screen here. So at the highest level, we can use expenditure profiling methods such as S-curves, or alternatively, we can use more detailed methods such as cost-loaded programs. What I would suggest, though, is in using cost-loaded programs, it does require careful planning, because your program activities need to be aligned to your cost activities. When costs are incurred, will need to be adjusted for specific time periods to reflect how the value of money will change, or how much inflation needs to be added. And for this, we tend to refer to indices. Unfortunately, there's limited forecast data in the Republic of Ireland that's comparable to the Building Cost Information Services that is available in the United Kingdom, but it is possible to benchmark BCIS data for comparable areas in the UK to comparable areas in the Republic of Ireland. An alternative might be that you can forecast Republic of Ireland indices using sources such as the Society of Chartered Surveyors Ireland or the Central Statistics Office. However, there is a certain amount of interpretation that needs to be considered as part of this, and it can be a specialist exercise to do that accurately. Some more mature organizations out there have their own inflation models which they've prepared and they use internally, and Chandler KBS are actually preparing 2 inflation models for 2 of our clients at the moment in the Republic of Ireland. So it's worth actually identifying if that source is available to you. As a final note here, it is possible to use higher level and more simplified models or procedures to build in an allowance for inflation, such as a percentage applicable to a midpoint of construction. But we would only suggest that those types of procedures are used in isolated instances and only at the early stages of a project, in projects that are of a certain value and lower value, simply because it's a lower risk the lower the value of the project. Just visually, I just wanted to show you how an S-curve actually looks. And this is basically plotted out based on a couple of projects that we've experienced outturn project information on in Northern Ireland. Risk then, so for anyone that's unfamiliar with it, I know risk's talked about quite a bit, but it's referred to quite a lot as known unknowns. And what this actually means is it's an exposure to a possible loss that is identifiable, but its occurrence is uncertain. Therefore, you can't actually include for it within your actual construction cost. It needs to be subject to a separate assessment. Assessing risk is important because a robust risk assessment can provide a better opportunity to establish an accurate and an adequate risk provision. Risk should also be considered as a project variable in construction projects. It needs to be managed, and if it's managed effectively, it can help ensure that the value is optimized in project delivery. I've set out here a very, very high level process in terms of how risks is managed in the cost management guidelines. So the first step here is the preparatory phase, which involves a little bit of risk research and the development of a risk register based on the templates that we have in the cost management guidelines. We would recommend that if the value of the project dictates, that a facilitated risk workshop is carried out by different members of the project team. And in these risk workshops, you would attend to identify project risks, assess the risks in terms of the probability of occurrence and the impact if they did occur. We then would allocate risks to the party and the person that are best placed to manage them. And then in terms of, we then need to, as a group, try and identify how we can manage these risks and mitigate their occurrence. Opportunities should be considered the same as risk. The only difference is we're trying to maximize the potential for opportunities to occur. So they should be treated the same way as risk and reviewed the same way. And it's very good to consider them as part of the risk management process as well. We recommend that for projects with a certain value, that a quantitative risk assessment is carried out. What we would typically do is carry out a Monte Carlo simulation using specialist software such as @risk. And for anyone that isn't familiar with the Monte Carlo simulation, it's basically simulating various project scenarios as how the project might turn out. And at different confidence levels, it will provide you with what risk value you should carry for the project. It generates a risk output, which we would incorporate into our cost estimates. And we would recommend that this process is repeated throughout each of the subsequent project stages. So risk will carry on through the construction phase as well. So it's important to manage it through construction. Visually, this is what the simplified risk register looks like. And visually, this is what the output from @risk and the Monte Carlo simulation looks like as well. Contingency then is the final aspect of uncertainty, and it's an assessment of the unknowns. So it's an exposure to a possible loss that is not identifiable and its occurrence is uncertain. And that's what basically makes it different from risk. Risk is an identifiable item. Contingency is building provision for something that's not identifiable. And assessing contingency is important because it helps us to ascertain an amount to cover costs not directly assessed in the cost estimate and that is potentially overlooked. We've developed a contingency calculator for the NTA. The optimism bias calculator is available as well, which is used in the UK. And both of these are based on the principles of reference class forecasting. Some projects major projects will develop their own reference class forecasting assessments. And these are generally carried out in projects such as Metrolink and Bus Connects that are both currently being designed in Dublin. So regardless of what you use, just make sure that it's logical. There are 4 features just to the contingency calculator that we've developed. I'm going to just briefly talk you through that. The first one is general project information. The next one is selecting the project phase and works classification. The next phase is developing the mitigation factors that we carry out. And the final phase is actually the risk output that will be applicable to our templates. In terms of quantifying contingency, the first step is one of the most important. Establishing the project phase and the works classification will help determine what the lower boundary for contingency and the upper boundary for contingency is in terms of the percentage applicable to the construction cost. The works classification is either standard or non-standard. A non-standard project is one that has onerous spatial constraints or is subject to innovative construction technology. Where the contingency percentage will fall will ultimately be dictated by step 3, which is the amount of mitigation that we've carried out against mitigating actions. So basically we objectively determine how much mitigation we could carry out, and this will essentially adjust the lower and upper boundary of where we fall and the applicable contingency percentage that we will apply within our cost estimates. I just wanted to show the link. This is an extract from the cost estimating templates, and it just shows you exactly where you would input this into our cost estimating templates. This would be applied to all of our costs excluding land, so that we're building a sufficient level for contingency. And obviously, as you would expect, a project progresses, the contingency would reduce because we would have a better understanding of the contingency and the design requirements. And that's just basically reflected on this high-level model here that we have from the TII cost management manual, just showing how the costs profile of a project should change as the project matures. The final step then is to populate the template. It's a very self-explanatory step, but it is important because it's the population of the template that will allow us to compare from project phase to phase. Measuring and improving on performance is important. So one of the first steps that we can do here is to benchmark. The process of benchmarking is essentially comparing cost estimates with other similar projects and the outturn cost from similar projects. The reason that we do this is it helps us to develop a confidence in the estimate. It will also help us to assess how much value for money is being offered by the project. But on the flip side, it also helps us to identify if there are any mistakes or inefficiencies in which we can develop value engineering proposals from this. We're talking about benchmarking on a cost management perspective, but benchmarking can also be used to measure the benefits and the program associated with the project. Performance can be measured from pre-construction stage to pre-construction stage, and also from pre-construction to outturn costs. But in doing so, we need to make sure that we have a format in place to measure these costs and to make sure it's comparable. And that's why we've developed the templates and the guidelines as we have. It basically makes sure that we can compare all costs and see maybe where a project begins to go wrong or where project costs begin to escalate. In terms of why we actually do measure performance, I personally like this definition. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. If we apply this to cost estimating, we need to think of it as a cycle. The cycle begins with the preparation of an estimate. We measure how accurate that estimate is. If there's any elements of inaccuracy, we need to identify why it was inaccurate and what is the area for improvement. We then implement these lessons learned and also good practice in the future estimates. And that cycle continues until at an organizational level, we become better and better at cost estimating. So just a few principles to take away, today, I think we're running pretty close to time here, is an estimate should be an accurate reflection of reality. And in order to do this, we should look at the following principles. We need to be honest with ourselves first and foremost. We have to take out any potential bias from wanting a project to go ahead or not go ahead. We need to actually objectively determine what we feel the outturn cost of a project should be. We should also try and create a single point of ownership. So that the person that takes charge of that cost estimate should want to make sure that it accurately reflects the outturn cost, and they will ultimately be held responsible for future estimates and for future reporting of costs. That creates that ethos of accountability and also transparency. Cost estimates should always be supplemented with context. So that might be the provision of a cost estimate report, but as a minimum, all cost estimates should have a list of assumptions of which the estimate is based on, what it includes and what it excludes. And finally, it's always good practice to subject your estimate to peer review, whether that be from an external organization or whether that be with one of your colleagues. And that colleague doesn't necessarily have to have a detail of that type of sector. Sometimes just a general overview and process is enough to identify any high-level mistakes. we've a few case studies here which you can go over in your own time. I think everyone's going to be provided with this slide deck. The general theme here to identify is what has gone wrong in a few different projects, the reason for the cost change, and highlighted in blue in each of these is how we feel if the process that we've identified in the NTA's cost management guidelines had been followed, how it would had the potential to overcome some of these reasons for change. So it's just some proactive views that we feel are worthwhile considering. I'm just going to go straight to the end and hand over again here to Roy. Happy to take any questions and answers. And if you have any further queries, I've put Eamon and my details on screen. And if you have any help that you need with any of your cost management in your projects, feel free to get in touch with either of us. So thank you for listening.